This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Hey, welcome to the show. So glad to be catching up with my friend Eric Peters as I do each week to talk about the passing scene and what's going on. And what a normal, tranquil world we're living in today, Eric.
Well, it looks that way out my window, but then again, I'm reminded that today might be Adlertag, which is a German word. Many people might not have heard it before. It means Eagle Day, and it's a historical reference to the attempt by the German Luftwaffe to dominate the British, which were refusing to lose the war in 1940. So the head of the German Air Force, Hermann Goering, sent pretty much everything that they had against the Brits, wave after wave, something like 1,000 sorties of bombers and fighters and everything else. And the British just stubbornly refused to lose. Here we are 80 years later, and it looks like tonight is our Adlertag. Trump keeps talking about ending a civilization. And that's his latest tweet. Did you see it?
Oh, yeah. I was concerned enough, on Easter Sunday when he, issued the F-bomb laden, open the effing straight. I forget what he called him. Anyway, he was insulting him and it's, using, their religious terminology and whatnot. Eric, I'm concerned. For the first time in my life, I'm legitimately concerned that we have someone sitting in a position of power who is mentally misfiring.
I agree. Did you catch Tucker Carlson's comments about Trump's Easter F-bomb?
I didn't. What did Tucker have to say?
Among other things, and I thought this was most apt, Tucker's a devout guy. He's a Christian. And he was extremely affronted by the fact that on Easter of all days, the president of the United States, this coarse, vulgar man, would drop F-bombs about killing people on Easter, and pointed out, a lot of the people who support Trump or who at least have supported him in the past are evangelical Christians. And they might want to give thought to the kind of man that they're continuing to support, who would say that sort of thing, on any day, but particularly on Easter. And I agree with you. I think that there is Houston, we have a problem. And, congruent with this, I think there are people in the military who think that there's a problem. You probably caught the news. Karen Kotowski had a great column about this the other day on Lou Rockwell, about this mass firing of people at the higher echelons of the military. Why would that happen now? At this particular moment, these are people who've been in there now for a significant amount of time. If they were woke libtards or whatever terminology you want to use, Trump had the option to replace them when he first was inaugurated or the day after. So why now? Well, I think why now? I agree with Karen. I think that these guys came to Trump and said, do not commit our ground troops to an invasion of Karg Island or anything else in Iran, because it's going to be a disaster. It's going to result in casualties. It's going to be bad news for us. It's not going to accomplish anything except kill people. And apparently, Trump couldn't abide that. And, this circles me back to Adlertag and to Goering's boss, who, of course, was Der Fuhrer, Adolf Hitler. And Hitler was a kind of personality like Trump. Sorry, I know that sometimes gets overused, but it's the truth. I reference a memoir by a guy named Ernst Hemstengel, who was for a while the head of the Foreign Press Office in Germany before the war. And he was an educated man who had American ties, knew America, had gone to Harvard, and he was trying to explain things to Hitler about America and what would be likely to happen if Trump decided to launch a war against the British and the French, and how disastrous this would be for Germany. Not a good idea. Not only did Hitler, refuse to listen to him, ultimately because Hemstengel continued to push it, he actually tried to have him killed, and the guy had to flee the country and get out. And I think that's the kind of scenario that we've got right now. I think this guy Trump is surrounded by yes men and sycophants, and anybody who would bring to him any sliver of the truth and ask him to please reflect and consider on what you're doing before you go off the rails here and do this thing. And I think we are indeed at a very dangerous juncture in our history. God only knows what's going to happen this evening.
Why does it feel like Mark Levin is now the architect of our foreign policy? I mean, it has that tone.
Why is Witkoff always standing behind, and Kushner, all these people, why are they always standing next to Trump and behind Trump? Whose interests are being served here?
Yeah.
Again, Americans are asking this, and you go on X and other social media platforms. I understand there are a lot of algorithms and bots there, but there is mass wholesale disaffection from MAGA, from Trump, not from MAGA. I correct myself, and this desperate attempt to just cleave and disassociate the populist, nationalist, America First movement away from this man who is utterly ruining it.
No, I'm with you. And I'm going to clarify, this is for my own sake more than anybody else's. This is not a call for everybody, hey, let's sit around and let's hate on Trump. This is a call to check your own intentions and make sure that you're not being caught up in the emotions or the cult of personality, if you will, that has people, marching in lockstep and cheering everything that he does out of a sense that, well, there are troops in harm's way and therefore we have to do this. We're at a very precarious place right now. And I would encourage people to take it seriously. There's never been a time where independent, resolute thinking, for yourself has been more important. And if you don't, you're going to find yourself in a position that I think Milton Meyer, in his book, They Thought They Were Free, the Germans, 1933 to 1945, he uncovered how the average citizen suddenly found themselves in a place where they're like, whoa, but it was too dangerous to say anything at that point.
Right. And that's how it always happens. Initially, it's uncomfortable, awkward, and then it becomes impossible, or at least if you do it, you're going to get in big trouble. And it's very important to not allow your principles to be subordinated to personalities. We don't owe Trump, the individual, the man, anything. Our allegiance ought to be to principles. That's what matters. And if he betrays those principles, well, then he's betrayed us, and we owe him no allegiance. And we shouldn't even cut him any slack as far as I'm concerned. It's a critical moment in American history, and no more of this. We who voted for Trump voted for the exact opposite of this. It's intolerable. And no, I'm not going to choke it down. And I hope that other people out there aren't going to choke it down either.
I think you said it beautifully. If you're going to tether your principles, or you tether yourself to something, tether yourself to principles, not to personalities, because those personalities sometimes will be led astray, and you don't want to be led with them. Can we talk about something a little less unpleasant? I mean, like maybe you'll have to use atomic scientists to measure this. Let's talk about tax season is here, and it's time to pay tribute to Caesar. And I don't know why, Eric, but this year I'm just chafing more than ever that I am going to end up paying thousands of dollars to a government that is doing everything possible to ruin my life and my children's lives through, debasing our money supply, through creating conflict where there was no need for conflict, and of course, fitting us for chains as well. And I know I'm not the only one who feels like, this is forced idolatry, and I'm not happy about it.
Do you remember hearing that term, that taxes are the price that we pay for civilization?
Right.
It's kind of like America is a free country. You don't hear it very often any longer, because now, obviously, we're being mulcted and fleeced to pay for barbarous things, and not only barbarous things, but barbarous things that have no relationship whatsoever to anything that's going on in this country that pertains to us as Americans who are forced to finance all of this. It's obscene. I'm with Marjorie Taylor Greene and a number of other prominent people who are calling for a mass refusal to comply. That may be the thing that has to be done. I mean, certainly we're not going to see the IRS folded up because of Doge. Remember that promise?
I do.
We're going to get the tariffs are going to pay the cost of the federal government. You're not going to have to file a 1040 anymore. There went another one out the window.
Yeah. Anybody making under, what was it, $250,000? Yeah. You won't have to pay taxes. What happened to that, Trump?
Machine gun of promises, and so when the machine gun of betrayals comes, you can't keep track of everything. It's so you're right. It's beyond obnoxious. The whole thing has gotten to the point that it's so overtly, obviously corrupt and criminal that we have an obligation to stand forth against it. If not, what are we? We're just cringing little worms who will just accept anything that they do to us.
Well, and again, I'm not trying to black pill anybody. I don't want people feeling hopeless, like, oh, there's just nothing that you can do. There are things we can do, but I'm thinking if there was ever time to, figuratively get your poop in a group, this is the time, because the cost of everything is going up. If whatever Trump is promising for today for Iran, if that is going to result in more destruction of oil infrastructure in the Persian Gulf, the cost of everything will continue to go up, not just gasoline, but every single thing that you purchase from the store. So I'm not saying panic buy, but I'm saying you'd be wise to lay up the things that you use the most while they're still available and relatively affordable, because that may not be the case in the near future.
And, stop to ponder what the world might look like in the near future, and how we might deal with it and how we might cope with it. And some aspects of it are actually not a bad thing. The less you have, the more free you are ultimately, and at the end of the day. And that especially is true as regards to debt. So many people are laden down with debt. They're in hock to mortgage companies. They're in hock to credit card companies. They're in hock for car payments. To the extent that you can cut that stuff out of your life, the better. And even if it means downsizing, that's not a bad thing either. You become less and less governable, the less and less in hock you are to all of these forces that are out there.
Yeah, they don't have as much leverage to use against you, buy your stuff. There was a great article on Lou Rockwell yesterday, and it was talking about Peter Schiff, and I'm trying to remember who some of the other economists were that were warning about this, but they were talking about the precarious situation that the nation is in generally, and debt was the common theme. These are not guys who march in lockstep. They have their own different slant on things, but they all agreed that debt is the thing that is in the process of slowly undoing us. And they made the distinction. Now, going into debt for business in order to grow that business is one thing. But if you're in debt just to maintain appearances, say, power or might around the world, you're in a situation where eventually it is going to ruin everything. And I think they correctly are calling that shot. That's where we are, and we should conduct ourselves accordingly.
Yeah, I think it applies to nations as well as to individuals. Debt can be seen as cancer because it eats you alive. That's ultimately what it does. I've been in a position, almost anybody's in a position to be able to buy a new car, let's say, in the sense that they'll write you a loan. If you have a pulse, they'll write you a loan. I've never done that. Even before the time that we live in now, I have always paid cash in full for every vehicle that I've ever owned in my life. Now, I've never owned a vehicle that I paid more than about $7,500 for. And, sometimes back in the past, some of my friends would say, why don't you get something nicer than that old truck that you're driving? Well, because my old truck is paid for. And what I liked about that was that, I'm an independent, self-employed guy, so my income is kind of peripatetic. You don't know exactly what you're going to be making, but then neither does the salaried guy, because you don't know that your job isn't going to go away next month. It could. And the thing of it is, if it does, and you have an $800 a month car payment, and you thought that your income was going to be adequate to cover that, and all of a sudden it's not, then what? The whole thing becomes a cascading spiral, not just car debt, credit card debt, all these things. People think, well, I can manage that monthly payment, but it becomes unmanageable when that whole rickety Jenga tower gets undermined because something happened. Well, something just happened. Now we're paying $1 plus more per gallon for gas and all these other things. And all of a sudden people have less money. So maybe they're not going to be able to make that minimum monthly payment on their 27 or 28% compounded monthly interest rate. And boom, just like that. I've seen this happen in my own family. People go from being able to kind of wing it to facing bankruptcy and foreclosure and losing everything. It's much better to live within your means and to live a more modest lifestyle. Pay for the things that you can afford to buy and learn to live without the things that you can't afford until you can.
And I love what you just said. I'm going to add one word to it that more of us need to learn how to embrace, and that word is enough. We've got to be able to look at what we have and find an appreciation for, what? I have enough. I was a little over a week ago, I was in Albuquerque helping to take care of the disposition of my dad's estate down there. And he was not a hoarder by any means, but even with as well organized as his home was, it's overwhelming trying to deal with all of that stuff. I look at my mom, who thankfully is still alive, but she has so much stuff to deal with. I'm already feeling the pressure of how will we deal with it when that day comes. And it just makes me, more and more minimalist in my thinking. And I think what you said earlier about, the less you have to lose, the more free you are. That's something that I'm going to be examining very, very closely over the next few months.
Yep. And, Dark cloud, silver lining. This could be a silver lining to the dark cloud. I think as a society, as a culture, we've sort of lost our way. The Great Depression is a long, long time ago, and there aren't that many people alive who can still remember it. Those who are very elderly. And most of us have grown up in a period of relative prosperity. When the stores at the supermarket, the shelves at the supermarket were always full, and we could always afford to buy it. We never gave a thought to it. We were able to get all the things that we need. That time may be coming to an end, and we may be forced to deal with frugality again, and being sensible and having future time orientation, and not living beyond our means. Living beyond our means is bad stuff. Even if you can do it in the moment, ultimately it sets a bad precedent. And so in the end, maybe it's a good thing that that's coming to an end.
I think it also sets a stage for unhappiness because thanks to a little help from social media, you're constantly comparing yourself. Is my car nice enough? Is it new enough? Do I live in a good enough neighborhood?
Never enough. To get back to what you said, it's never enough. You get a brand new car today. Well, a year from now, it's not going to be a brand new car. And, you see your next door neighbor's got a brand new car. Well, I guess I got to get a brand new car now. Otherwise, they're going to look at me and think, oh, I'm poor. I can't afford a brand new car.
Yep. So, okay, let me share something positive. I actually shared this with Eric before we went on the air, but I'm holding up my Real ID driver's license, and I'm happy to report that there's a big chunk of holes through there that spell out the word void, because I went back in and said, I don't want the one with the gold star. And thankfully, the clerk was very kind, and she helped me. And so I have a new non-Real ID driver's license on the way. And, I thought it was a wonderful opportunity because the clerk at the DMV asked me, so why don't you want that? And my explanation was because for 25 years I've been saying no to Real ID. And she said, oh, I get it. She was very understanding. And well, isn't that going to give you some inconvenience? It might, but I'd rather take that inconvenience than make my identity some government granted privilege.
Absolutely. I actually did the same thing. My license was up for renewal in November, which is still many months away. But I thought about it and thought, in my state, which is Virginia, where we have Governor Spanberger now, we still have the option of not having the Real ID. But I thought, what if they change the law between now and November and get rid of that possibility? So I scuttled on down to the DMV last week, and I got my license renewed early without the star and without the Real ID. Now, I know some people are listening to this and thinking, oh, it's such a trivial thing. It doesn't really matter. Yeah, it does, because it's a statement of I will not comply. I'm not going along with it. This is how we win, by not complying, not going along with it, particularly for the sake of some stupid convenience that we can live without. Most of us, for example, do not have to fly. I understand there are people who have to fly for work. It's part of the job. But you don't have to go to Disneyland. I know you want to take the kids to Disneyland. That's nice and everything. You don't have to do it. And sometimes sacrifices are important. I said way back when the TSA was first introduced and we got a homeland in place of America at that time, if only about 20% of the public that flew voluntarily just said, I'm not going to do it. I'm not participating in this. I'm not going to be treated as if I just got arrested and convicted for a crime and be patted down and have my possessions rifled through. Not doing it. If they had done that and stuck to it for 6 months, the airlines would have screamed bloody murder and the TSA would have been disbanded. But they didn't do it because they wanted to go to Disneyland.
By the way, Eric, you had a great article here just a few days ago, actually just a couple of days ago, about your really digital ear tag. And for anybody who's been sitting on the fence wondering, well, should I get the Real ID star or not? I would recommend read that article and ask yourself the serious questions. How far am I willing to yield, for the sake of convenience, as opposed to, how far am I willing to be inconvenienced and keep what remains of my freedoms?
Yeah, understand that they keep pushing this. Somehow I used mocking language, but I think mocking language is sometimes helpful in that column. How real is a Real ID? Apparently your driver's license isn't really enough of an ID somehow. And what's next? You're going to have your fingerprint. You're going to have an iris scan, maybe a chip. If you accept all the preceding things, how could you make a cogent, logical argument against having to have a chip implanted in your body? And if you don't think that's coming, if you think that that's hyperbolic and paranoid and extreme, consider where we are. If you had gone back to when you and I were in high school and told people they'd have to have a real ID, and they'd have to get frisked in order to get on a commercial airplane and all these other things, you would have been mocked. You would have been characterized as some nut job guy who lives in a bunker somewhere. And yet here we are. Principles matter. You set a precedent, you give them some ground, they're going to take more ground every single time.
Hear, hear. And I want to throw one final thought out here regarding identity. And that this has less to do with the government giving you a card that says, okay, you are who we say you are. This is more along the lines of distinguishing between our opinions and our identity. The difference being you own an opinion, but your identity owns you. So if you think something's a great idea, fantastic. But if you accept that idea as your identity, and come on, we all know people who have done this and continue to do this, you've crossed a line. You've allowed an opinion to be installed where it has no right to be, and we see a lot of this being done under the name of engagement. People, oh, well, if I'm this online, then I can monetize it and I can make money. Don't be so free to give away what is precious, including your identity.
Yep. You also become a kind of an NPC if you allow that to define who you are. I've always been struck by, here's I think a fine example, because I think it really makes the point. These people who insist on identifying themselves according to who they are attracted to, who they sleep with. I can think of nothing that is more antithetical to what it means to be a human being. Animals have sex. It's biologically programmed. And if you somehow, that's the thing, that's the criteria. I'm a gay man. I'm a heterosexual man. I'm whatever. No, you're a human. And if you have ideas, I want to hear them. I don't want to hear about what your inclinations are and what your private activities are, or your skin color, or your religion, or any of that stuff.
Amen. All right. I have to ask you, just because I always love to get your take on all things automotive. Anything you'd like to report on? The Trans Am or anything you've tested?
Well, I've got an article up on EP Autos today that is actually, I'm hoping, fingers crossed, this is going to be good news. You're familiar with Jay Leno. He's known as being the former host of The Tonight Show, but he's also known to car people because he's a big car guy. And, I like that about Jay Leno. He's got a vast collection of antique vehicles, I think almost 200 of the things. Anyway, he has been actively in front of promoting an exemption from California's ridiculous rigmarole that requires antique vehicles to go through these emissions test protocols. And it's absurd because the number of antique vehicles, we're talking about cars that are 35 plus years old, that are in service as a daily driver is less than 1% of the cars on the road. So it's punitive. Wouldn't matter if they were rolling coal, had no catalytic converter, whatever, who cares? It's not relevant in terms of air quality at all. So it's just punitive. And he's trying to get that exemption put in. Now, I'd go a little farther. The whole thing is rigmarole and ridiculous because vehicles that have been made since the 80s, since the mid-late 80s, are all fuel injected, computer controlled, have catalytic converters. Since the early 2000s, most of them qualify as, and this is the EPA's term, PZEV, partial zero emissions vehicle, meaning that their emissions are so low that they're practically in the same category as an electric vehicle in terms of tailpipe exhaust emissions. Because again, the emissions controls are now not only sophisticated, they're integrated. Back in the 60s and the 70s, when it first started, they took engines that had been designed in the 50s that were never imagined to, have to worry about emissions controls. And they grafted all these crude controls onto them. They put limiter caps on the carburetors and they screwed in the mixture screws, leaned them out. They ran terribly. And so, of course, people tampered with them because it ran better without the emissions controls. That's not the case today. Most people, 99% of people do not fiddle with their vehicles anymore. And they run remarkably cleanly. They don't produce any emissions. So why are people compelled to waste a significant amount of time once a year, typically, and money to go stand in a queue somewhere and have some government geek shove a thing up their tailpipe or connect it to an OBD reader so that they can be, oh, you're good. It's the same kind of stupid kabuki like at the airport, getting frisked and patted. We're stopping the terrorists. No, you're not. You're just hassling people for no good reason and relieving them of money. So I've got an article up on the site that gets into that whole topic.
Love it. All right. I'll include links to Eric's website in my show notes. Eric Peters, thank you so much for being my guest today.
You bet, Brian. Look forward to next time.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show.